Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. Before I start talking about TED, since we, in our introduction, saw the Vietnamese armada of the boat people, I want to pass along a story that I heard recently from a former Navy officer who was serving at the time in the South Pacific. And he said that they would see these boats all the time of overloaded, really unseaworthy craft. But they had orders not to take on any refugees unless they witnessed the boats actually sinking. That was the dividing line. You would have people in completely overloaded boats in bad weather conditions, people with no food, no water, clearly, and no destination, just out there, floating in the sea. So they had a policy on their ship where they pull up to these boats and they would send a chief down to inspect the craft. And without fail, the chief would disappear. He'd go below decks for a while, if there was a deck. And then he would come back and report that there were holes in the hull and that the vessel was sinking. If there were no holes, he would make them. And they would deliberately sink the craft so that they could take on the refugees. That was the policy on this ship. And they saved a lot of people that way. I don't know what the people in Washington were thinking. But that was what the U.S. Navy was thinking, to save people. So I just wanted to pass that along as a little anecdote I picked up because I thought it really spoke to the spirit and the kindness and the humanity of our naval officers who saw these refugees out there with no hope and had these ridiculous orders from Washington to not help. So in any case. Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. The TED Offensive. You may have heard of it. There we go. I just want to talk about TED and the book that came out in 2010 that I wrote, which will be available in paperback in October, if you're interested. And really, why I was revisiting TED has a lot to do with the events that are happening right now. It wasn't just history for its own sake. Actually, there's a lot more politics in it. And basically, this is how TED is remembered, as a surprise attack on symbolic targets during which reports in the news media turned the American people against the war effort and drove Lyndon Johnson to the bargaining table. If you talk to people today about TED, just sort of regular folks who know anything about Vietnam, you'll get a line similar to that. And particularly from journalists, since I work at a newspaper now, I can tell you all about it. But these days, you always see TED in the news. And here's some sample headlines that reference the TED Offensive. For Iraq, Afghanistan, drug cartels in northern Mexico, for example, the WikiLeaks document leak is somehow related to the TED Offensive. Joe Klein, I didn't quite get his argument. I just think he wanted to have that headline. And, so forth. So there are all kinds of TED Offensive comparisons that are out there. You see them all the time. And there are very important reasons for this from the enemy's point of view. Because my background is in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. The only way that terrorists and insurgents can challenge the United States is through the information domain. It's through news reports, it's through propaganda, it's through perceptions. In a stand-up fight on the battlefield, they can't defeat us. A terror attack, a car bomb, some kind of low-level attack. It will not bring about the victory militarily. Usually most of their guys get killed, even if they're not already suicide attackers. But the TED Offensive, and you can find this explicitly in the writings of the terrorists where they reference Vietnam, because Vietnam is the model for them, where forces that could not match us on the battlefield nevertheless won significant victories. And I know we can talk about well, they didn't really defeat us, or if you look at the Easter Offensive and then what happened in 75, that's not their argument. They don't get into that kind of detail. All they're looking at is the political impact, what we said at the end when the U.S. Congress said, no more, we're not going to support our allies anymore, we're just going to leave. In fact, Osama bin Laden said something very similar to that in a letter he wrote addressing people in the Arab world, people in the Middle East, particularly the rulers, like Muslim rulers. He said, you think the Americans are your friends, but someday you're going to wind up like the South Vietnamese. The Americans are just going to go home, and then you'll have to face us. Well, he's dead now, so they're not going to face him. But that was his point, though, and it gets into their thinking of what America's role is in the world. That yes, we'll go and we'll try to support our allies, but at the end of the day, if it gets too costly, then the Americans will leave. And Tet is part of their model because the bad guys have internalized this notion that the Tet Offensive was the key turning point where the American people who had been supporting the war then said, no, we're not going to support it anymore, and then that was the end of it. So that's why Tet is important today, and that's why journalists and folks who continually make reference to the Tet Offensive are, whether they know it or not, they're helping out the bad guys in this war of images and influence. And I'm not saying that they're aligned with the enemy. I'm just saying that that's part of what the insurgents and the terrorists are trying to do. They're trying to influence events through that. So, right, it's the only way that they can win. But here's the problem. That version of the Tet Offensive that is commonly out there is not true. On all four of those counts, I would argue it was not a surprise attack, that it was not intended to be a symbolic attack, that it did not increase anti-war sentiment, and that it didn't drive LBJ to the bargaining table. So on all four of those points, and let me address them. First, not a surprise attack. Now, let me just say this. It wasn't a surprise to people who knew about it. Not everybody knew about it. You had reporters after the fact saying, if you knew it was going to happen, why didn't you tell us? Things like this to the higher command. And their response was, well, we didn't want the enemy to know that we knew either. If we told you, then they would know. If you have your enemy's plan, you don't advertise the fact. You let them make a mistake. And interestingly, just to jump ahead a little bit, when Little Tet came, and we had intelligence about Little Tet, it was all over newspaper headlines before the fact, because I think that learning occurred somewhere, that you have to tell in advance that these things are coming, otherwise the press gets all excited. And I don't want to take too long because we're already behind schedule, but to go through the various things that we had, and they're listed here and they're in my book. But we had captured their strategic plans. We had captured some of their tactical plans from before the attack, and then set up defenses accordingly. And then the enemy came exactly as they said they would in their tactical plans, and were soundly defeated. We had Lieutenant General Frederick Wand, who had to argue with Westmoreland, and I'll concur that General Westmoreland was kind of denying. He always denied the evidence for a long time that the attack was coming, even up to the point where it was happening, because for some reason he didn't think it would happen during the Tet truce. I don't know why he didn't think that, because communists don't lie to us? I mean, it's almost dogmatic. If you go back through the documents of the time, it's like this talking point that no one could be moved from, that the attack would either happen before or after the truce, but not during it, when it did. I think that if that was intelligence failure, it was analytical failure. It wasn't failure because we didn't have the information. We had the information. We had the documents. Even in the press, people were talking about it. There was, a briefing at the U.S. Embassy in the first week of January 1968 where they went over some of this stuff. There was an article in the Washington Post a few days before the Tet Offensive began, in which the author talked about the expected spring offensive. It was out there in the air. People were thinking about it. They were talking about it. Then the enemy the Viet Cong, in some cases, they attacked 2 days too soon. Many of them attacked 1 day too soon, and then some stepped off on time. But by the day that the attack came, the planned day of the attack, the entire country was on alert. So it's hard to argue that that was a surprise. Now, if you're a journalist in Washington who wasn't paying attention, and then suddenly you have all these reports, maybe you were surprised. Hence we get that kind of coverage. We're talking about intelligence failure and so forth. But I don't think that you can argue that the people who were there on the ground were surprised, unless it was maybe by the scope of it. Certainly not by the day it actually happened, because how can it be a surprise if the whole country's on alert? Nevertheless, that's part of the Tet storyline now, that it was all a surprise attack. Secondly, the question of whether it was an attack on symbolic targets. Because all the terrorist attacks today and insurgents attacks, they're all geared towards symbolism or trying to grab a headline or something like that. And one of my main beefs against relating those types of attacks to Tet is in terms of the scope. Because if you have a guy set off a car bomb somewhere, well, that's obviously not good. We would prefer that that kind of thing doesn't happen. But the Tet Offensive was a massive undertaking that had been planned for a year, involving 80,000 troops attacking every major city and village in South Vietnam. I mean, it was a big deal, and it was a last-ditch attempt by the North Vietnamese to try to achieve victory. They believed that the Southerners were ready to have an uprising and to support them. In all their planning documents, they talk about this, how they'll have this first wave of attacks, and then they'll be reinforced by people who will spontaneously rise up and give them weapons. And this will undercut the rationale for the U.S. to be there, because the government will be overthrown and the Americans will have to leave. Because they also didn't want to fight us head-to-head, which was probably a good idea. So, in that respect, defeating this plan was a big deal, because they had this major attack plan, not symbolic, but intended to win. They thought that Tet was going to be a major victory for them. It would be a war-ending victory, or at least the major phase of a three-part attack that would lead to this. Yet, in the press, it was called a symbolic victory. And usually, and if you talk to military audiences, they'll say, oh yeah, that was the media's fault. But digging into the documents, I found that it really wasn't the fault of the press. It was the fault of the Johnson administration. Now, yes, there were things like the coverage of the U.S. Embassy attack, which in the overall scheme of things in the Tet Offensive was not that important. 19 guys attacking the embassy, with orders to hold it and await reinforcements that were never scheduled and not coming, but were believed to be part of this mass uprising that was going to happen. And of course, they were mostly killed, and 3 guys survived, and it wasn't such a big deal. But to the press, it was a huge deal, because it was seen as this attack on a symbol of U.S. power. It was also a place where everybody could go and they could talk to U.S. officials. And of course, General Westmoreland went there and gave a statement. And so in all those respects, it was a big deal. And it dominated the press coverage on the first day of Tet. The embassy attack, seen as a big thing. But where the storyline of the symbolic nature of the overall offensive came from was from the CIA. On the first day of the attack, the White House sent a tasker to the agency saying, tell us what's going on. What's your assessment of what's going on? And the CIA came back with a set of talking points, one of which was they thought that the attacks were mainly intended to be symbolic. And the reason for this was that the analysts looked at the overall attack plan, which they already had, and they concluded that it was so bad, that it made so little sense, that the enemy's assessment of the situation in the ground in South Vietnam was so off, and that their assumptions were so foolish, that the plan made no sense in terms of its stated objectives. From the CIA's point of view, the plan could not work. And so they assumed the enemy knows it can't work. They said, well, couldn't the enemy just be wrong? In fact, they were. But from the agency's point of view, they said, well, this really isn't going to work. So what are they really doing? They're trying to send us a message. I would argue this is a lot of mirror imaging because, the way we were fighting the war was all about sending messages and, modulating conflict and stuff like that. So the CIA mirror imaged that and said, yeah, these are symbolic attacks. They're trying to win, yes, but if they don't, they're just trying to send a message, which is nowhere in any of the captured documents that we have. It was just something that was invented at Langley. They sent this back to the White House. It got into the talking points of the President and the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman. And then on the second day, when they were having press conferences and also testifying before Congress, this was relayed. This message was out there in statements both from Lyndon Johnson and from Secretary McNamara. I'm sorry, General Wheeler, I think he said it. I'd have to go back and check. But they said, we think that these are symbolic attacks. So it wasn't the press. The press followed the lead of the administration. It wasn't just some invented thing that the administration was pushing back on. It was in administration talking points. They said symbolic attack. So once the President said it, once the Secretary of Defense said it, that was it. It was embedded that these were symbolic. And, as I say, a self-inflicted wound. Why is that important? It's important because if you're doing a regular military attack where you have specific objectives and you fail to meet every one of them, which the communist forces did, then you can reasonably say that it failed. You can reasonably say that the attacker lost. But if you say that the attacks were symbolic, well, who's to say who wins or loses? Who's to say what it means? We mounted an attack on your embassy and all of our attacking force was wiped out. Well, okay, in strictly military terms, well, you didn't meet your objective and so you lose. But if you want to say, oh, it was all symbolism. Okay, well, debate about it. Was there a winner? Was there a loser? That's the only way that insurgents and terrorists can win. See, something like the embassy attack is what Al-Qaeda or other groups look at today and say, that's the kind of strategic effect that we want to have, where it starts this huge debate over things. Even if all our guys get killed, it doesn't matter, so long as we can have that strategic effect in the information domain. So that's why it was so important. That's why that little, analytical hiccup of the CIA was so critical, because once that got fed up to the top and they started talking about it, that put all that into play. And this was totally unplanned by the North. It's in none of their documents. They don't even talk about it. Later they pick it up, of course, because why not? If the enemy's handing you a weapon, you don't turn it away, you use it. So that was very bad. Here's an example of sort of unconscious use of these types of terminologies, saying that the Viet Cong suicide squad attacked the U.S. Embassy. They were not a suicide squad. It was also referred to as a kamikaze attack. It was not. It was an attack that was intended to seize and hold the embassy and await reinforcements. The orders to the sappers were not go there, create mayhem, and get killed, which is what happened. But if you report it as suicide squad, then okay, well, they're dead. So if they were a suicide squad and they're dead, they must have achieved their mission, right? And again, sort of unconscious headline writing or reporting because they weren't really thinking about it. They'd say, well, this was a hopeless attack, so they must have been a suicide squad. That was just an assumption. Because their orders were not go there and get killed. And even if you say, okay, well, the high command wasn't going to tell them to go get killed, fine, but even up the chain, any of the operational or strategic planning, none of it said, we're going to attack and lose, and then we're going to manipulate the image of it. So it was the press, yes, but it was also the administration. You get a lot of negative reporting coming out of TED. Someone did a content analysis a few years ago in a dissertation that I found doing this research that found that before the TED offensive, if you looked at editorial commentary on the war, 79% of it was pro-war and 21% was against. After the TED offensive, it was flipped, 29% pro-war, 71% negative. So that's a very interesting metric. Best metric, during the TED offensive, 100% negative. So clearly, editorially, I'm not talking about the argument in the big story or any of that, but just editorially, where print or television took a stand, during TED, it was all negative. And Walter Cronkite has become kind of the symbol of that. Someone who was kind of pro-war before and then explicitly against, if not the war, at least the way it was being conducted during and after the TED offensive. And well, in the book I go into how different reporters, different anchormen had different views on these things. Howard K. Smith was very pro the war, and other people were very against it. But the reason Cronkite was significant was he seemed to switch. And this led to the alleged statement from Lyndon Johnson, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And LBJ's belief that Walter Cronkite was kind of a bellwether. And by the way, he was number 2 in the ratings at the time. I just want to point that out. Huntley Brinkley were number 1. So it wasn't everyone in America. I've heard a lot of things since then, and particularly since he passed away, about he was the moral conscience of the nation and stuff like this. Well, maybe he was, but he was also number 2 in the ratings at the time. He was number 1 later in the 70s. Okay, fine, but at this point, just want to point that out. And I mean, there were severe problems. If you look back at Cronkite's analysis of what was going on, he really didn't have a grip on what was happening in the war. After he toured the battlefield of Hue, he said that he saw the future of the war as being one of large land armies locked in conventional conflict. He said it reminded him of the Battle of the Bulge, which raises the question, who were the Nazis? In his analogy. Interesting question. But he was wrong. The future wasn't one of large land armies locked in conflict. I mean, maybe later when you get in the 70s, sure. But he was talking about how sort of what he saw at Hue was going to be the future, the immediate future, that it would be a conventional conflict, which I would argue, maybe Mr. Sorley would agree, that's the war that Westmoreland wanted. Would you agree with that? That he wanted this big conventional war. I'd say that's the war that he was planning for, that he wanted to go north, that he, make it a real war, not just this, unconventional war that he wasn't comfortable with. But that wasn't the case. Or things like saying, when he visited Khe Sanh, that the North Vietnamese could take Khe Sanh if they wanted to. That was part of his reportage. Well, what kind of statement is that? It makes victory impossible. Because that places you, if you're the American defender, and a reporter says, the enemy could take your position if they wanted to, well, that means that if they don't take it, they just didn't want to. How are you supposed to say that you won anything if you've successfully defended your position? That's because the enemy didn't want it bad enough. Well, they're throwing everything they have at it. So what's the basis for that statement? Just things like that, which worked their way into Cronkite's reporting. So he had this very significantly flawed analysis of what was going on over there. He said it was his proudest moment. Okay, fine. But the key thing is, it doesn't really matter whether Cronkite was right or wrong. What matters is what impact did he have. And if he was the guy who convinced Lyndon Johnson that he couldn't win, or that the American people had deserted him, well then fine. That's the kind of impact that people are looking for, whether they're reporters who want to have the big scoop or whether they're terrorists who want to have that kind of influence. I mean, think about it. You do something that influences a report that influences the top decision maker in the country. That's a good day at the office. Okay, so this is the image of the time, that Americans were, peaceniks and, hell no, we won't go, or what have you. But in fact, the public wanted to escalate. And you really have to dig into the polls to find this. And I think a lot of the polling is ignored. But in that first month, I'm talking about February of 1968, the immediate reaction to the Tet Offensive was not a defeatist, let's give up and let's get the heck out. The grounding point of that point is the fact that LBJ's approval rating declined. It did. It dropped. Let me just say, it didn't drop to its lowest point in terms of his war leadership. That was in August of 67. And yeah, I agree, 67 was a critical year for the war. In fact, the August 67 low point, it was like 28%, was really what kicked off the Charm Offensive. Bringing back Westmoreland and having other people go around the country, surrogates, saying things are great, the war is improving, and so forth, which had such a negative influence on Tet because people's expectations had been raised so high that Tet looked increasingly bad because of that. So, yes, LBJ's approval dropped, but not because people didn't want to win the war. And I have here just a little graph that appeared in the New York Times, which the Times chose not really to go into any deep analysis. But on the left, that line on the left is the number of people self-identifying as hawks. Are you a hawk or a dove? Are you, do you want to escalate the war or do you want to get out? And that goes from December up into the week after Tet. And the number of hawks was increasing. And the figure on the right is, do you approve of Johnson's dealing with the war? And that's going down. And the Times said, oh, well, the hawks don't think Johnson is one of them. No kidding. Because the hawks were the people, if you want an authentic hawk spokesman, you go to Ronald Reagan, who said that we can just, pave it like a parking lot and paint stripes on it and be home by Christmas. Actual Reagan quote. He was being a little flippant, but the point is, you didn't just have hawks and doves, you really had three camps. There were the hawks who wanted to escalate, the doves who wanted to get out, and then the middle people, who were actually the policymakers, who wanted to have this sort of moderated type of war. So yes, between December and the first week after Tet, the people who self-identified as hawks went up 8%, from 52 to 60%. The number of doves, which are sort of represented as being the majority viewpoint, clearly not, we're down at 24%. And that was down 7% from December. So the number of people who want to, get the job done are increasing. The number of people who, are doves who just want to, wash their hands of it are decreasing. And a very interesting statistic I found, if you really dig in there, one of the polls, I think it was a Harris poll, asked, would it be okay to use nuclear weapons to solve this situation? 28% of Americans said yes. So you had more people who wanted to use nuclear weapons than you had doves. They call them nuclear hawks. The people just said, bomb them back in the Stone Age. 28%. I know I'm not advocating that, by the way, that would be a reasonable response to what was going on. But the point is, in terms of perceptions, what's the perception since the Tet Offensive and, the contemporaneous one is that, oh, the American people were, the doves were taking flight, as John Roach used to say. Not true. Not in February. It came later. Now the fourth thing, am I up to the fourth thing? That Johnson was driven to the bargaining table. He was not driven to the bargaining table. He wanted negotiations all along. If you go back to his Johns Hopkins speech at the beginning of the war, where he stated that his objective was to have a negotiated end. He said that they would convince, the strategic outline of the war was to convince the North Vietnamese that the United States could not be defeated. That's really a critical orientation, because if you go to your enemy and say, hey, here's my war objective, I'm going to defeat you, you're going to be beaten and you're going to lose. That's one thing. If you go to your enemy and say, look, my objective is to convince you that you can't win. Slightly different, but critically different, because it gives the initiative to the enemy to say, well, okay, let's see how long you can last. And of course, at Hopkins, LBJ said, that we have the will and we're going to stay and stuff like, well, maybe not. We'll see how long that lasts. And in fact, it just lasted a short time. But from the beginning, the strategy was to have negotiations. And there were 70 peace initiatives proffered between 1964 and 1968 before Tet, all of which were refused by the North Vietnamese, through their surrogates. 70 peace initiatives. And Tet was an inflection point where Johnson could either have escalated, radically, de-escalated, or, sued for peace, or, left, or just tried to muddle through. And I would say that people like Westmoreland and Wheeler were saying, now's the time, the enemy's wounded, we're ready to go, we've been beefing up our conventional forces in I Corps, we can head north if you want. Johnson was not interested in that. In fact, from the beginning, he always believed that if we went north, if we escalated, it would lead to Chinese intervention or nuclear war or something like that. That's the major difference between the Vietnamese conflict and the Korean conflict is, nuclear weapons on both sides. So he had been looking for signals from the beginning. I have a great quote in here from the Guam conference where he says the only signals he's been getting are F you, Lyndon Johnson, at the beginning. But, on February 8th, a week after Tet, Robert Kennedy gives this very important speech, of course, when he's gearing up to challenge Johnson for the nomination in the Democratic Party, in which he talks about how it's time for us to negotiate, as though that wasn't what we were trying to do from day one. Walter Cronkite also said, we now have to admit, we have to sue for peace or something. As if. Because it's all the Johnson administration wanted from the beginning, was to negotiate. It was the North Vietnamese who refused to or set terms that we couldn't accept. So that's really the background to March 31st, when LBJ says that he will not run for re-election in 1968, that he would not seek the nomination of his party, because he thought that at the end of the day, he was the impediment. He personalized it. That it was a mark of good faith on his part to the North. Of course, we now know that the North thought it was a trick. They didn't trust it whatsoever. Is this guy crazy? Why is he giving up power? It must be deceiving us. Something. Because, there's misperception on both sides, usually in almost every conflict. But Hanoi ultimately did agree to talks and then, showed their sincerity with launching Little Tet on the eve of the Paris peace talks, literally. But just to go to the point, the major point, Tet did not drive Johnson to the bargaining table. He was at the bargaining table. He built the bargaining table. He'd been sitting at the bargaining table for years. If anything, it drove the other side there, because they understood that their plan having failed and their forces being destroyed, they had to shift into a political warfare position. And so it was an okay time to open negotiations. So, just to sum up, of the contemporary lessons of Tet, given this information. First is not giving the enemy credit for having a better plan than they appear to have. They can screw up. And frequently they do. Insurgents and terrorists, they're not always the smartest guys. I would hear briefings over the last decade about how Al-Qaeda are these cunning, adaptive, long-term planners, fighting this 100-year strategic plan and stuff like that. Well, no, they're not. Their plan failed. They're complex and adaptive, the terrorists, because now they're underground and they're surviving. Well, they're not. We're killing them. And, so long as they're fighting, they're winning. No, that's not true. Look at their objectives. You have to judge these plans on the basis of what they seek to do, not against what they achieve, because they might not achieve much if it's just killing some people. What they want is power. What they want to do is take over countries. What they want to do is soundly defeat us. Well, they're not doing any of that, so don't give them more credit than they deserve. That's why don't redefine their objectives. That's what we did in Tet. The objective of the Tet Offensive was to take over the whole country. What they managed to do was get a bunch of their guys killed, and then they hung on away for a month. Okay, fine, don't give them credit for a win. That was a big loss. You have to estimate it against what they intended, not against what they achieved. With press coverage in unconventional warfare is going to be negative, and there's nothing you can do about it, because sadly, the nature of unconventional warfare is such that it's not very interesting. It's the same thing. Any of the reporters in Vietnam, in Iraq, Afghanistan, all saying the same thing. You're just fighting the same battle, or the same village, or the same place. You can see it in Afghanistan today. The same FOB, the same province, where it was, Helmand or wherever. And it's just the same thing. You send a patrol out, the patrol comes back, etc. And so reporters are going to look for other things to report. They're going to look for the fantastic or the unusual, or they might just not report anything at all. And I can tell you, just as an aside, but as an editorial writer, if I write an editorial that criticizes the administration on healthcare policy or something like that, it'll get a ton of readers. If I write an editorial saying stay the course in Afghanistan or something like that, support the troops, or I don't know what, no one will read it because nobody cares. The American people have tuned out. And ultimately they tuned out in Vietnam too. After Johnson gave up, after Lyndon Johnson said, I'm not going to seek the nomination of my party, and he said, okay, we're going to finally have talks. That's when public opinion turned against the war. That's when people said, if President Johnson's giving up, then we are too. And so the American people, Middle America didn't desert Johnson; he deserted them. So yeah, if you're trying to get good news in a counterinsurgency or the war on terrorism, it's extremely difficult to do. Killing bin Laden, good news story. Yes, headlines. Story of the year. Outside of that, you don't have a lot. Public opinion, not as malleable as you think it is. And this is just you can look at this in social science and get in this argument. But generally speaking, just because a few journalists report some things and have splashy headlines and that sort of thing, the public doesn't shift from one foot to another that quickly. It tends to be a much longer term thing. And something I noticed that was very interesting, you can look at Korea, Vietnam, the latter part of Korea, I'm talking not the first year, but beyond that. Iraq and Afghanistan, you get the same thing. If you ask the public, do you approve of the war or the course of the war or something like that, it goes back and forth. It can go back and forth. What doesn't go back and forth is if you ask people, is it worth it? That just goes down. At the beginning of a war, people say it's worth it. The longer it goes, the lower it gets. And that is an independent variable of whether people say, is the war going in the right direction or not? And we saw that in Iraq. Because right before the surge in 2007, you had most Americans saying the war in Iraq is not worth it, and we don't approve of it. A year later, people said, by a majority of 60-some-odd%, we do approve of the course of the war in Iraq, but we still think it's not worth it. Interesting. So public opinion, it's not going to respond just to a splashy headline here or there. It's going to respond to important things on the ground. And really that speaks to the rationality of the American people, which should be a bad news for the terrorists who think that the American people can be influenced by, a sudden event. Although I will give one caveat to that, which is 9/11. Because yes, the American people were very influenced by the event, but not in the way that the terrorists expected. In fact, sometime after that, there was a quote from a leading Taliban figure who was affiliated with Al-Qaeda, who said, who was bragging about the attack, saying, "We gave the Americans a Pearl Harbor." Well, you sure did. And look what that led to. Since you're bragging about Pearl Harbor, it led to Hiroshima, fella. So, they shouldn't go around trying to create that kind of strategic effect. Exploit opportunities for decisive action. That's just my editorial comment, that if Lyndon Johnson had gone the way that the Hawks were saying and ramped it up, I think it would have led to a better outcome. That, of course, is highly debatable. We can go on for the years about that. But I think that they probably, if we had pushed it, I think we could have ended the war on favorable terms. But that wasn't the war that Johnson wanted to fight. That's a whole other argument. And finally, that strong leadership can carry the day. And this gets into the Braystrup thesis about why Tet was perceived so poorly, and it was because Johnson never really set the terms of it in the press. He never really led during Tet. He tried to downplay Tet because it fit his prior narrative better to downplay it. And so Johnson was kind of AWOL. He didn't really try to use Tet in any specific way. He just kind of tried to get people to ignore it. And that was a problem. He should have exploited it because people were rallying. He could have done something, but he chose not to. And in fact, ultimately, he chose to give up. So that's all I have to say about Tet for now. I'll be happy to take any of your questions and anything you'd like to say.
If you'll permit me to add to what you've had to say, I have a short anecdote about Walter Cronkite. General Fred Wyand, whose picture you used, was then commanding 2nd Field Force at Corps Level Headquarters. And in the days leading up to that, using primarily traffic analysis, a technique of communications intelligence, he had determined that the enemy was repositioning forces to attack the Saigon area. He had gone to General Abrams, and with Abrams, they had gone to Westmoreland and convinced him to bring some forces back from the border areas, and that lessened the severity of the impact on Saigon, which still suffered greatly. When Cronkite came out, Westmoreland said, "You should go and talk to Wyand. He's got some interesting information about how we anticipated and prepared for this attack." So Cronkite goes up there. General Wyand said, "I gave him the full briefing. It was all recorded on camera. Lasted about an hour. And at the end, Cronkite said to General Wyand, 'That's all very interesting, General, but I'm probably not going to use any of it in my program. I've decided that I'm against this war and I'm going to do everything possible to bring it to an end.'" And then he went back and reported, as we know. He later wrote a memoir in which he said, "My job was to make sure that the American public to whom I was reporting did not see any hint of my own personal opinion in what I was reporting." Of course, he had violated that big time and then continued to report on the war for 7 years. When the Cronkite biography was reviewed about a month ago in the New York Times Book Review, I wrote them a letter to the editor that pointed out some of the things I've just said. I don't have to tell you, of course, it didn't get published.
That's a great anecdote. I didn't know he was that explicit about it.
I'll send you a copy.
I would love to see that. Yeah, again, Cronkite. If you can find, there's this expression called, I talk about this in the book, called the Walter Cronkite moment, and it's this theoretical point at which things go from one side to another side amongst the press. When this spokesman, this conscience of the nation, or whatever, the moral voice of a generation, or some such thing, comes out, who was on one side and goes to the other side. And particularly during the Iraq War, and when it started to go not so well, you would find people explicitly talking about this. When is the Walter Cronkite moment? When will this moment come? And you have people declaring it. Like William F. Buckley said something, about Iraq that wasn't pro. It's the Walter Cronkite moment. Or Bill O'Reilly said something. That's it. It's the Cronkite moment. It was like, it was important with Cronkite because, it seemed to be a spontaneous thing that he did, whether or not apparently it wasn't. But to make it so explicit, like it's going to be this one statement or this one point in time by one person. Keith Olbermann, declared himself to be, in his way, right? This is it. This is the Walter Cronkite moment. Because he said so. Well, no, it isn't, because you're not Walter Cronkite, fellow. You're a guy who's going to get fired from your job. So, it's interesting that he was that explicit, that he explicitly denied reality and just went with his impression. But it shows the impact of these things, that today people consciously were talking about this as though it was this event that was just waiting to happen in Iraq or, in some future war. I'm sure it'll be popping up again with respect to whoever's next. I just find the way that TED has sunk into the minds, particularly of the press, as this model of event. This is how it's going to happen, and that it can be recreated. And again, if it were just journalists who thought this, it wouldn't be so dangerous. But it's the enemy who thinks this way and tries consciously to create that impact, to initiate that model. There's even, I've seen two of these actually, sort of press studies by the enemy, where they have looked at our journalists and looked at how press coverage works in the media and have campaigns specifically designed to create these effects. The enemy has studied us and they know how we operate. They're not dummies. They follow the press very closely because they know, like I said, it's the only battleground on which they have an equal footing. Very dangerous. We play their game, they play our game. It's very bad.